When I stand before you, judges of Israel, in this court to accuse Adolf Eichmann, I do not stand alone. Here with me at this moment stand 6 million prosecutors. But alas, they cannot rise to level the finger of accusation in the direction of the glass dock and cry out, "J'accuse," against the man who sits there.
Adolf Eichmann, the name alone conjures images of cold bureaucracy and unfathomable evil. But how did a man like him rise to become one of the principal architects of the Holocaust? How did a boy born in 1906 in the small town of Solingen, Germany, grow into the very personification of genocide? The rain fell in steady sheets, casting the streets in a muted gray haze. Outside, the world moved on, oblivious to the storm brewing in the shadows of history. Inside, as the darkness of night settled, the truth about Eichmann was inching closer to the surface. He had escaped his past for years, but that could only last so long. As a child, Eichmann was nothing extraordinary. He was not a soldier or an intellectual, just a boy eager for attention, eager for a sense of purpose. Growing up in a strict household, Eichmann's early years were steeped in an acute desire to prove himself, to rise beyond his humble beginnings. Like so many men of ambition, he longed to be something more than ordinary. His path, however, would be shaped not by his capacity for compassion, but by his capacity for efficiency. He wasn't a man with a violent temperament or an overbearing passion for cruelty. No, Eichmann's power lay in his ability to organize and execute. He became a master of logistics, the type of man who could take an abstract plan and turn it into something tangible, something real. And it was this talent that caught the attention of the Nazi regime, a regime hungry for men who could facilitate its brutal vision without hesitation, without question. By the time Eichmann joined the SS in the early 1930s, he was already beginning to step into a role he would never have imagined. He was the perfect tool for a regime that saw people not as individuals, but as resources, numbers to be moved, controlled, eliminated. Eichmann's rise through the ranks was swift, his ability to carry out orders with cold precision, earning him favor with higher-ups. But even as Eichmann gained more power, he remained disturbingly indifferent to the atrocities unfolding around him. The suffering, the death, the destruction. It was all part of the plan, all part of his job. He was a bureaucrat, after all, not a soldier. His job was to oversee the logistics of death. The deportation of Jews from across Europe to concentration and extermination camps. And Eichmann executed this task with mechanical efficiency. His role was not one of direct violence, but of cold, calculated organization. The final solution, the systematic extermination of over 6 million Jews, was Eichmann's project. His hands, though clean of blood, were responsible for the deaths of millions. His precision made him an invaluable cog in the Nazi machine. As Eichmann's role grew, so did his fear. Each calculated move, each signature on the countless forms, tightened the noose around his own future. For all the power he wielded, he was also marked, a man who had sealed his own fate, tied to a history of unimaginable horror. And then when the war ended and the world seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, Eichmann disappeared. For a time, the world thought he had vanished. But what if this man, this architect of horror, had never been stopped? If he had slipped into history's fog, would we have ever known the full extent of his crimes? Would the world have ever confronted the evil he embodied? What is our responsibility to confront the past? To right the wrongs when the world has moved on? Could you stand idle in the face of such betrayal? Would you act when the world demands justice? Or would you allow the silence to suffocate the truth? If this story made you question your own response to injustice, don't let it go unseen. Subscribe now, like and comment with your thoughts. What would you have done? Eichmann wasn't a man of violence. He was a man of logistics. His role was to organize, not to execute, but his actions led to the deaths of millions. He oversaw the transportation of Jews to ghettos, concentration camps and death camps with chilling precision. His job was to move people like numbers on a map. To Eichmann, the victims were not individuals. they were simply items to be processed. Each form he signed, each order he issued, tightened the gears of the Nazi death machine. There was no hatred in his heart, just blind, chilling obedience to authority. The cold efficiency with which he performed his role made him a perfect cog in the Holocaust bureaucratic system. But Eichmann's success in carrying out the final solution came at a cost. The more his role expanded, the more enemies he made within the Nazi regime. His name became synonymous with the efficiency of mass murder, and the silence that once protected him was now his greatest threat. What if Eichmann had never been found? What if he had continued to live in silence, never facing justice? Could you live with the knowledge that evil was allowed to fade into history without consequence? The war ended, and Germany lay in ruins. The Reich was defeated, its cities crumbling under the weight of its own atrocities. Yet, amid the destruction, Eichmann was nowhere to be found. Unlike so many others, he had not been caught, nor had he perished on the battlefield. Instead, Eichmann had a different fate in mind. A quiet escape into the shadows of a world in chaos. In 1946, Eichmann began his flight from Europe, slipping past the Allied forces that were rounding up Nazi war criminals. He adopted the alias Ricardo Clement, and using forged documents, crossed into Argentina, one of the many South American countries that had become a refuge for Nazis fleeing prosecution. There, in a country far removed from the ravages of the war, he would fade into the background, blending in with the masses, lost in a world that was rebuilding itself from the wreckage. For years, Eichmann's past remained buried beneath layers of false identities and a carefully constructed facade. The man who had been instrumental in the orchestration of genocide, the architect of death, became an anonymous factory worker in Argentina. The very system he had helped build, a machine of destruction that took millions of lives, had collapsed. Yet Eichmann survived. His new life was a delicate lie, one that would be protected by a network of Nazi sympathizers, former SS officers and Catholic clergy who helped him and many others like him slip past the reach of justice. In Argentina, Eichmann's days were spent in a constant state of tension. Though the world had turned its attention away from the war, and the hunt for Nazis seemed to slow, Eichmann lived with a weight of fear that never left him. He was a man who had once held immense power, now reduced to living like a hunted animal. The constant fear of discovery loomed over him, yet he continued to believe that the world had moved on. The years passed in a tense quiet, with Eichmann growing increasingly paranoid about the inevitable reckoning that seemed to hang just beyond his reach. He knew that time was not on his side. The world was changing, and the old networks that had shielded him were beginning to weaken. Yet, he clung to the hope that no one would remember the man he had been, the crimes he had committed, and that his silence would be his protection. But Eichmann could not escape his own legacy. His guilt, his actions, were written in the history of the world. He lived in waiting, knowing that eventually, someone, somewhere, would come for him. But where would it come from? Who would remember? Who would care? The rat lines were not just escape routes, they were highways to freedom for some of the most notorious war criminals of World War II. Stretching across Europe and into South America, these clandestine paths allowed the guilty flee the wreckage of the war to vanish into the shadows of history. The rat lines were operated by a network of former Nazi sympathizers, ex-SS officers, and in some cases, even the Catholic Church, all working together to help those like Eichmann evade capture. For these men, the war was over. But their crimes were not. Eichmann, after fleeing Europe, would find his refuge within this network. With new identities and forged documents, he escaped into Argentina. Here, under the alias Ricardo Clement, he could breathe freely again, hidden from the world that sought to hold him accountable for his role in the mass murder of millions. The rat lines gave him the freedom to rebuild a life, far from the horrors he had orchestrated, a life that would remain undisturbed for years. However, even as Eichmann settled into this false sense of safety, the world was not finished with him. His quiet life in Argentina, surrounded by those who had helped him escape, was a fragile existence. The pursuit for justice never stopped. It simply shifted, moving like a slow-moving tide, gathering strength. Eichmann may have thought he had outrun his past, but the relentless march of time would catch up with him. For decades, the rat lines continued to operate, allowing Eichmann and countless others to disappear into the shadows. These escape routes, which had carried Eichmann and others to safety, were a source of dark comfort for war criminals. But behind these lifelines, there was always the looming reality that history would not forget. The ghosts of their actions never vanished. And now, the question remains. What if the world had acted sooner? What if these escape routes had been uncovered before they could serve as lifelines? Would the atrocities that followed have been prevented? Would fewer lives have been lost if Eichmann's escape had been thwarted earlier? Would you have acted to stop them, or would you have let these ghosts of history slip away unnoticed? The answer to this question remains one of the greatest moral dilemmas of the post-war era. The waiting was the hardest part. In the aftermath of the war, Eichmann's name began to fade from the public's eye, but his shadow lingered. The 1950s were marked by a slow, methodical pursuit. No grand headlines, no sweeping manhunts. Instead, Mossad, Israel's intelligence service, quietly sifted through scraps of information, piecing together fragments of the past. Every tip, every lead was another piece of a puzzle that, once completed, would reveal the man responsible for the systematic murder of millions. Adolf Eichmann, for his part, had become a ghost. He was no longer a figure of authority, no longer the Nazi bureaucrat of death. Instead, he was a small-town factory worker, blending into the chaos of post-war Argentina. The world had moved on, or so it seemed. Eichmann had disappeared into the crowd, a man whose crimes were seemingly lost to history. Yet, for those who remembered, for those who had lived through the horrors he had helped orchestrate, Eichmann's escape was a festering wound. What if they never found him? What if Eichmann had remained hidden, a name whispered only in the dark corners of the world, his crimes fading into distant memory? Would the truth about the Holocaust, its architects, its machinery remain obscured? The fear was real. If Eichmann vanished forever, would his crimes slip through the cracks of history, forgotten by the generations that followed? As the years passed, Mossad's pursuit of Eichmann was a quiet, steady operation. There were no wild chases, no dramatic revelations, only silence, punctuated by occasional glimpses of a man hiding behind false identities. Every piece of information Mossad gathered seemed insignificant on its own, but together they formed a portrait of a man who had once been at the center of Nazi operations, an instrument of destruction whose role in history couldn't be ignored. Meanwhile, Israel's government remained vigilant, though silent. They knew how delicate the situation was. One wrong move, one misstep, and Eichmann could disappear forever. Time was both an ally and an enemy. They knew that every step closer to Eichmann's capture was another step closer to confronting the evil he had unleashed. The question was always in the back of their minds. What if they never found him? Would justice be forever out of reach? Or would history finally catch up with the man who had made the Holocaust his bureaucratic masterpiece? In 1957, Fritz Bauer, a German Jewish prosecutor, became a key figure in the search for Eichmann. Bauer, deeply committed to justice, received a crucial tip from Lothar Hermann, a Holocaust survivor, who had identified Eichmann's location in Argentina. Hermann's information led Bauer to pass the details to the Israeli government. However, Bauer's efforts were met with resistance. His own government was reluctant to pursue Eichmann, fearing the political repercussions of reopening the painful chapter of Nazi war crimes. Despite this, Bauer refused to give up. He understood the importance of holding Eichmann accountable for his role in the Holocaust and believed that justice had to be served, no matter the cost. Bauer's persistence set the stage for Eichmann's eventual capture. Without his actions, the momentum toward Eichmann's arrest might never have been sparked. His efforts ultimately led to the Mossad being notified, and the search for Eichmann intensified. But Bauer's drive for justice did not come without cost. The world around him, including many within the German government, had moved on, unwilling to confront the past. What if someone had acted sooner? Could Eichmann's capture have been accelerated? Would fewer lives have been lost if the pursuit of justice had started earlier? Bauer's relentless pursuit of Eichmann reminds us of the consequences of silence in the face of evil. When we fail to act, we allow history to repeat itself, and the weight of that silence will fall upon future generations. The pursuit of Eichmann was riddled with obstacles. For every credible lead that surfaced, there were multiple false ones, and Mossad's agents found themselves chasing countless dead ends. The intelligence gathered was fragmented, often incomplete, requiring agents to rely on scraps of information, and unreliable sources. The search for Eichmann became a painstaking puzzle, with each piece potentially leading to a breakthrough, but often falling short. Mossad's agents combed through various false sightings and misdirections. Each time they thought they had tracked Eichmann down, they were met with disappointment. The process was slow and methodical, driven by a relentless commitment to uncover the truth. Despite these setbacks, they kept moving forward, aware that they could not afford to lose the trail. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any updates in this ongoing story of justice and persistence. In 1960, their persistence finally paid off. After years of searching, they confirmed Eichmann's location in Buenos Aires, Argentina. His time as a fugitive was nearing its end, but the lingering question remains. What if those scattered fragments of information had never come together? What if the pieces of the puzzle had remained unconnected? Would Eichmann have slipped through the cracks and escaped justice forever? The consequences of such a delay could have been catastrophic. Eichmann would have remained free, continuing to evade the reckoning he so richly deserved. In 1960, after years of chasing false leads and piecing together fragmented intelligence, Mossad finally confirmed Eichmann's location. Led by Isser Harel, the team of agents tracked him down to Buenos Aires, where he had been living under the alias Ricardo Clement. The long, patient wait was over. On May 11, 1960, Eichmann was captured near his home. The operation to capture him was swift and precise. Mossad agents moved quickly, knowing that the longer they waited, the higher the risk of Eichmann escaping once again. The stakes were immense. This was not just the capture of a fugitive, but the moment when one of history's most notorious criminals would face the consequences of his actions. For Eichmann, it was the end of his decades-long escape. His past, once hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and false identities, was about to be exposed for the world to see. The man who had overseen the logistics of the Holocaust would no longer be a shadow. His crimes would no longer be confined to whispers. The world would now know who he was and what he had done. The trial would soon begin, and Eichmann would have no choice but to confront the full weight of his actions. The tension surrounding Eichmann's extraction was palpable. Mossad agents had finally seized him, but the real challenge had only just begun, getting him out of Argentina and into Israel without being detected. The covert operation was fraught with danger. Every move had to be calculated, every step executed with flawless precision. The risks were high. Losing Eichmann now would mean a lifetime of regret for the agents who had worked tirelessly to capture him. One mistake could allow this pivotal moment in history to slip through their fingers. The journey from Buenos Aires to Israel was a dangerous one. Eichmann, once the mastermind behind the Holocaust logistics, was now a prisoner, a symbol of the regime he helped build. Yet, as he sat bound and silent, the stakes grew ever higher. As Mossad agents worked swiftly to get him to safety, they knew that each passing minute brought them closer to the revelation of Eichmann's identity to the world. The secrecy surrounding his extraction was necessary, but the truth was no longer far from the surface. With Eichmann safely en route to Israel, the world's attention was about to turn toward the trial that would finally bring justice to the millions who had suffered under his regime. Eichmann, a man who had lived in the shadows for so long, would now face the light. The questions he had long avoided, the truths he had evaded, were about to be forced into the open. Eichmann's trial in 1961 was not just a legal proceeding, it was a moment for the entire world to confront the scale of his crimes. It was the first time that the man responsible for overseeing the logistics of the Holocaust would face direct scrutiny for his role in the genocide. Survivors took the stand, their voices shaking but resolute, as they detailed the depths of Eichmann's involvement in the extermination of millions. His defense, claiming that he was just following orders, fell on deaf ears. The court could not and would not accept that excuse. Eichmann was not a mere pawn. He was a key player in a system designed to annihilate entire populations. The trial became a turning point, not just in the search for justice for Eichmann, but for the way the world would begin to reckon with the horrors of the Holocaust and the accountability of its perpetrators. What if you had been there, watching the trial unfold? Would you have stood for justice or remained silent, as so many did? What if you had the power to act, but didn't? Injustice only survives when we fail to confront it. Like, comment, and subscribe, because the legacy of those who suffered depends on our ability to act when history calls us to responsibility, don't let their voices fade into silence. On June 1, 1962, Eichmann was executed by hanging in Ramla prison, Israel. His death marked the end of his reign of terror, a final act of justice that resonated across the globe. For many survivors and families of the victims, Eichmann's execution was a painful but necessary moment of closure. The man who had overseen the systematic murder of millions was no longer a shadow in history. Though delayed, justice had finally been served. Eichmann's fate was a reminder that even those who evade justice for years cannot escape the consequences of their actions forever. The world could finally breathe again, knowing that Eichmann had been held accountable for the atrocities he orchestrated. The echoes of his actions, however, would never be forgotten. His execution was just one chapter in the ongoing fight to remember the past and prevent history from repeating itself. The Eichmann trial left an indelible mark on history. It became a symbol of the power of justice and a stark reminder of the importance of confronting evil when it rears its head. The trial was not just about one man being held accountable, but about the collective responsibility we all share to ensure such horrors are never forgotten, never allowed to happen again. What if Eichmann had never been caught? What if the world had stood idly by, allowing his legacy of terror to continue unchecked? The trial forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths and ask difficult questions. It was a reminder that, no matter how long it takes, justice must always be pursued. Eichmann's capture and trial gave survivors a long overdue sense of closure, and for the world, it was a painful but necessary step in the pursuit of accountability. The questions that the trial raised still echo today, urging us all to remember, to never turn a blind eye, and to continue to stand against evil in all its form. The trial of Adolf Eichmann remains a pivotal milestone in Holocaust history. It reinforced the necessity of justice, the importance of accountability, and the global commitment to never forget the atrocities of the past. Eichmann's capture and subsequent trial were not just the end of his story. They marked the beginning of a global dialogue about human rights, memory, and the future of justice in an ever-changing world. Have we learned enough? Eichmann's legacy serves as a harsh reminder that the fight for justice doesn't end with one conviction. It is a continuous struggle that demands vigilance and action. We cannot remain silent when injustice calls. If we don't act now, how long will we wait until it's too late? Eichmann's trial taught us the price of indifference, and its legacy urges us to stand against evil whenever and wherever it emerges. Let his story be a reminder that silence is never an option.